For 300 years, humanity reached into the stars with trembling hands and hopeful eyes. We built our telescopes, aimed them at the dark, and listened. We sent our probes outward past the edge of the solar system, encoded our mathematics into radio signals, and whispered our existence into the void like a child pressing their ear to a locked door, desperate to know if something breathed on the other side. For 300 years, the universe answered with silence. And humanity, being humanity, decided that silence was simply an invitation to knock louder. Then we found the first ruin. It was on a moon orbiting a gas giant 40 light-years from Earth, a dead world with no atmosphere and no warmth, its surface scoured clean by centuries of solar wind. The structure we found there had no name we could pronounce, no architecture we could immediately understand. It was simply old. Incomprehensibly, terrifyingly old. Carbon dating placed its construction at roughly 800,000 years before the first human being stood upright on the African savanna. Archaeologist Dr. James Morrow, the man who first stepped inside, later said in his report that the building felt less like a ruin and more like a held breath, as though whatever had lived there had not died, but simply stopped. We found the note 3 days into excavation. Not a note in any human sense, no paper, no ink, no screen. It was carved into a wall of black stone in a language that took our finest linguistic algorithms 4 months to partially decode. But when we finally understood it, the words were simple. Chillingly, impossibly simple. It said, "We mapped the stars and found the garden world. We reached toward it. We stopped. They guard something worse than death. Do not follow us." We assumed it was a warning about a predator species. Something violent, perhaps. A civilization that had destroyed this ancient race and left their ruins as a monument to conquest. Terrible, yes, but understandable. The universe was large and evolution was brutal, and the strong had always preyed upon the weak. We filed the note, continued our research, and moved on. We were scientists. We were explorers. We were human. And humans, when confronted with a warning sign, have always had a genetic compulsion to ask why. We should have asked that question more carefully. The second ruin was found 11 years later in a binary star system near the edge of the Orion Arm. This civilization had been more advanced, their technology recognizable, their architecture breathtaking even in decay. They had traveled between stars. They had built megastructures. They had, by every measurable standard, been magnificent. And they were gone. Completely, utterly gone. Not conquered, not displaced. Simply absent, as though they had one day collectively decided to stop existing. Their cities were intact. Their ships were docked. Their food stores were still partially preserved. They had vanished mid-sentence, mid-meal, mid-life. On the central pillar of their greatest city, carved in a script that matched no known language, but which our translation engines eventually cracked after 2 exhausting years, was a message. Different words. Different species. Different galaxy. Same meaning. The blue world at the spiral's edge is watched. We sent 3 ships to observe it. None returned. Those who took them did not kill them. They kept them. We do not know what for. We chose silence. We chose survival. Whoever reads this, we beg you, choose the same. Dr. Morrow, now 61 and white-haired and no longer the wide-eyed young man who had first stepped into that airless ruin 40 years prior, read the translation from his hospital bed on Mars, where he was recovering from a cardiac event. He reportedly read it twice. Then he set the tablet down, stared at the ceiling for a long time, and said to the nurse beside him, "They're all talking about us, aren't they?" It was not a question. Over the next 40 years, humanity found 11 more dead civilizations. 11 species, 11 histories, 11 rises and falls written in stone and light and encoded crystal. Some had been primitive when they died, barely touching the edges of space travel. Others had been so advanced that our scientists wept looking at the remnants of their technology, understanding perhaps 1% of what they were seeing. They were different in every conceivable way. Biology, culture, language, belief, architecture, music. One species had communicated entirely through color. Another had built cities inside stars. Another had apparently achieved a form of collective consciousness that made individual death meaningless. And every single one of them, every last civilization, from the most primitive to the most godlike, had left the same note. Not identical words. Not identical warnings. But identical meaning, identical fear, identical conclusion. They had all looked toward the small blue world at the edge of the spiral arm. They had all reached toward it, or considered reaching toward it, or sent probes, or scouts, or signals. And they had all, in their own language and their own terror, written some version of the same truth into their final monuments. Earth is guarded. Whatever guards it is not a protector. Do not go there. Do not look too long. Do not let them know you exist. 11 civilizations. 11 warnings. 1 address. Ours. The Interstellar Governance Council convened on Earth in the year 2387 in a chamber built specifically for moments of civilizational wait. It sat beneath 3 kilometers of reinforced bedrock in a mountain range in what had once been called Norway, chosen not for symbolism, but for geology, for the cold certainty of ancient stone above their heads. Around the table sat 43 representatives from humanity's colonies, stations, and outposts spread across 19 star systems. They were the furthest flung species in known history. They were also, apparently, the most dangerous address in the galaxy. Admiral Rena Vasquez, commander of the Deep Fleet, stood at the head of the table and did not waste time. She had spent 30 years in space and had the kind of face that had stopped performing emotions it didn't mean. She placed her hands flat on the table, looked at every person in that room, and said, 43 civilizations have now been catalogued. We have full or partial translations from 31 of them. Every translation references Earth. Every reference describes something that guards this planet. No translation describes what that something is. I am here because before we proceed any further as a species, we need to decide whether we want to know. The silence that followed was the loudest thing any of them had ever heard. General Tobias Krenn, head of planetary defense, spoke first. He was a broad man with a soldier's economy of words. We've been running passive scans on our own solar system for 2 decades looking for anomalies. Unknown energy signatures, gravitational irregularities, anything that shouldn't be here. He paused. 3 months ago, we found something. Nobody breathed. It's beneath the ocean. Specifically, beneath the Mariana Trench. A structure. Non-human. Older than the planet's current tectonic configuration, which means it predates complex life on Earth. It is not broadcasting. It is not active by any measure we can detect. But it is there. And it is enormous. He let that land. We have not sent anyone down. We have not pinged it. We have not so much as aimed a sonar pulse in its direction since we identified it. Because the moment we found it, every long-range sensor array we have detected movement, brief, faint, and then gone, from 14 different directions in deep space. Vasquez nodded slowly. It noticed us noticing it. Yes, Krenn said, which means it's aware. Which means whatever the dead civilizations were warning us about was never out there. He pointed at the floor, at the ocean, at the impossible thing sitting in the deepest dark of their own world. It was always here. Right here. With us. Beneath us. and we have been living on top of it for 200,000 years without knowing. The representative from the Proxima colony, a young woman named Iris Tan, raised her hand with the careful control of someone trying very hard not to show fear. What does it want? Kren looked at her. We don't know. But nothing has attacked us. Nothing has communicated with us. Whatever it is, it has had 200 millennia to act, and it has chosen not to. He paused. The question is whether it's been waiting for us to be ready, or waiting for us to be worth it. They sent 3 people down. Not because 3 was the right number. There was no right number for something like this. But because 3 was the smallest team that could carry the equipment needed and still function if one person broke. They went in a vessel designed for pressure, not speed. It took 11 hours to reach the bottom. 11 hours of descending through absolute black, through cold that pressed against the hull like a living thing, through silence so complete that the 3 of them had to consciously remind themselves to breathe. Commander Yusuf Adeyemi led the team. He was 54, had served in deep space for 2 decades, and had the particular calm of a man who had made peace with fear so long ago that they had become something like old friends. Beside him sat Dr. Lena Marsh, the xenoarchaeologist who had spent the last decade translating the dead civilization's warnings and who had, somewhat famously, refused psychological counseling after the 9th translation on the grounds that understanding the shape of a thing was better than being afraid of it in the dark. The third was a young engineer named Sam Okafor, 26 years old, chosen for his technical skills and, unofficially, because he had tested the highest in the category the psychologists had labeled functional composure under existential threat, which was a clinical way of saying he did not panic when the universe stopped making sense. They reached the structure at 3:47 station time. It was not what any of them had imagined. There are moments in human experience where the mind, confronted with something genuinely beyond its frame of reference, simply goes quiet. Not blank, quiet. Like a cathedral. Like standing at the edge of a cliff over an ocean that has no far shore. The structure was not a building in any recognizable sense. It was more like a condition. A place where the geometry of the world had been deliberately, precisely altered, where angles that should not exist held their shape with absolute patience, where the rock around it had simply decided to conform to rules that predated physics as humanity understood it. And at its center, where Adeyemi's lights finally reached, was something that pulsed. Not mechanically. Not electronically. It pulsed the way a heart pulses. With rhythm, with intention, with the unmistakable quality of something alive and aware and present. Adeyemi's hand moved to his communicator. His voice, when it came, was steady. He had promised himself it would be. Control, this is Adeyemi. We have visual on the structure. It is intact. It is active. He paused, and in the pause the entire weight of human history pressed against his chest. And it is looking at us. Dr. Marsh leaned forward in her harness, her eyes wide and brilliant and entirely unafraid. She had translated 11 warnings from 11 dead civilizations. She had read their fear. She had understood their choice to retreat, to go silent, to carve their terror into stone, and leave it for whoever came next. She had also made her own choice. It's not hostile, she said quietly, with the certainty of someone whose entire career had been the study of last words. If it wanted us gone, we would already be gone. Every civilization that left a warning was warning the wrong thing. She turned to Adeyemi. They thought it was a predator. They thought it was a weapon. She looked back at the pulsing center of the structure, at the ancient impossible heart of something that had waited beneath their world since before their species had learned to walk. It's a test. The council received Adeyemi's full report 14 hours after the team resurfaced. They read it in the same underground chamber, under the same Norwegian mountain, in the same cold silence that had defined every meeting since this had begun. When the last representative finished reading, nobody spoke for a very long time. Then Vasquez set her tablet down and said, "Every dead civilization ran." "Yes," said Kryn. "They saw it. They understood it was there. And they chose silence." She looked at the table. They carved warnings and retreated and eventually disappeared. All of them. Every single one of the most advanced species in galactic history chose to turn away. She was quiet for a moment. And it let them. "Yes," said Kryn again. "Because they failed," said Iris Tan softly. Everyone turned to her. She was the youngest person in the room, and she said it without apology. That's what Dr. Marsh's report says. Not in those words, but that's what it means. The structure isn't a weapon. It isn't a prison. It's a threshold. Whatever built it placed it here, and then waited to see which species, across all of time and all of the galaxy, would do what every other species failed to do. She looked at Vasquez. "Go back." The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It had weight but not dread. It had gravity but not despair. It felt, for the first time in months of fear and confusion and careful cataloging of other species' terror, like something that belonged to humanity. Like a moment that was theirs. Adeyemi's report had ended with a single line that Dr. Marsh had spoken aloud on the ascent back to the surface, her voice echoing in the small vessel while the pressure eased around them, and the black gave way to deep blue and then to light. She had looked at the recording device and spoken it plainly, the way someone speaks a thing they have understood for a long time and are only now ready to say out loud. The civilizations that left warnings were not destroyed. They were not conquered. They simply looked at something ancient and unknowable and chose the comfort of retreat over the terror of understanding. And in doing so, they chose to stop. But we are the species that looked at the ocean and built ships. We looked at the sky and built wings. We looked at the stars and built engines. We have never, in 200,000 years, chosen the comfort of not knowing. That is not arrogance. That is not recklessness. That is who we are. And I believe with everything I am, that whatever built that structure and placed it beneath our world and waited across uncountable centuries chose this planet for exactly that reason. Not because we are the strongest, not because we are the most advanced, but because we are the ones who always go back. 3 weeks later, humanity returned to the structure beneath the Mariana Trench. Not with 3 people. With a team. With scientists and engineers and linguists and a small, stubborn archaeologist who had never once been afraid of last words. They went back with the full intention of understanding, not conquering, not weaponizing, not retreating. Understanding. The structure, for the first time in the entirety of its existence, opened. What was inside would take humanity a generation to fully comprehend. What it meant would take longer. But on that day, in the deep and ancient dark beneath the deepest ocean on the only planet in galactic history brave enough to answer, the long wait finally ended. 43 civilizations had stood at this threshold. 43 had turned away. The 44th knocked on the door. And something impossibly old, something that had built its patience into the bedrock of a young world and waited for a species worthy of what came next, finally answered.